Part 2. Second Depression. How could I have tripped over depression again? 5 years later, depression reared its lonely, frightening, fearful head for the second time. Ironically, this occurred following a session of learning about stress management and depression. I had even been teaching classes about overcoming depression. I had also been instrumental in planning and beginning a magazine and a support group for women. Once again, I went from being highly involved inside and outside of my family and church to being dysfunctional overnight. Chapter 7. Like Night and Day. Back to guilt, anger, and frustration. I called the suicide line and got a recording. In the spring of 1985, I had just completed teaching community workshops entitled How to Understand and Overcome Depression One Step at a Time. Darla and I, along with a number of other women, joined forces with Jean and Marcia Newman, who had a publishing company called Wellspring that became the source of distribution for our magazine. About that time, depression hit me once again. Our family had moved from Magna to West Jordan 3 years earlier. Cindy and Heidi were elementary age, and Tiffany was a preschooler. It was as though depression itself was mocking all the effort I was putting into trying to help others and called me a liar. It was laughing at me and questioning my very sanity. Who do you think you are, standing up in front of all those people, pretending that you now have it all together? How can you tell them what to do when you are so far from where you should be? You are far too busy. You don't spend enough time with your kids. You're not good enough. You're not doing enough for Dan. Well, the voice went on, piercing me, twisting me, and punishing me. I tried harder to quiet the accusations. I made more charts for my family. I taught more classes for women and even stayed up all night typing a mission statement for Coping Network. I took in daycare children again so I could help pay for having the basement finished and ended up with several extra children during the summer break. Then it happened, similar to my earlier experience. I was outside in the backyard with the kids when 5-year-old Darren, one of my favorite daycare children, said or did something mean to my daughter Heidi, and I lost my temper. Picking him up, I screamed at him, "Don't you ever treat Heidi like that again." With that, I shook his shoulders and then shoved him down on the grass as the other kids watched in total surprise. I was shocked and disgusted at my behavior. Trembling, I locked myself in my bedroom and called all the parents of my daycare clients and told them that I wouldn't be able to be doing daycare the rest of the summer. The next morning, I could hardly get out of bed. My energy was gone, and so was my ambition, optimism, and hope. In its place was the familiar companions of despair, depression, and self-condemnation. A day or so later, I managed to make it out of my bedroom and crawl under the kitchen table into a sleeping bag. I had to postpone or discontinue all of my outside activities because although I felt guilty about bailing out on people, I simply couldn't bring myself to meet my obligations. I felt utterly useless. I had regressed so fast that in desperation that morning I picked up the phone and called the suicide hotline. Not because I was suicidal, but because I just wanted to talk to someone confidentially, to someone who might help me think this thing through. The phone rang, and I heard a recording drone. "If this is an emergency, please hang up and call 911. Otherwise, if you need help immediately, please call..." Well, when I called the "Help Immediately" number, I asked angrily, "Do I have to have a razor blade to my wrist in order to talk to someone?" I then proceeded to tell the volunteer all about the 3 stages of grief and how to do cognitive therapy and all kinds of information about overcoming depression. Then I said that although I knew all of this, I couldn't bring myself to actually do any of it. All I could do was cry, sleep, and feel guilty. The volunteer on the phone then suggested that I get to a psychiatrist as soon as possible. After this, Cher, a friend, and the president of Coping Network called. "Patricia," she began, "I'm thinking that it would be good for you to see a psychiatrist and be evaluated for bipolar disorder. I am bipolar, and I see the same highs and lows in you as I see in myself. The night you stayed up typing the bylaws for Coping Network seemed pretty manic to me because my high moods are higher than normal people. My lows dip deeper than normal as well because they are so far from the excitement and exuberance that I experience through my high moods. It wasn't until I was evaluated and put on medication that I could maintain stability in life. Patricia, if you are bipolar, that might explain why you're experiencing depression again, even though you've learned so much." Cher also reminded me that often a person suffering from depression needs medication to supply their brain with chemicals that are missing in order to function correctly again. Lean on me. Darla and Cher were both great supports as I struggled to find light in my darkened world. Cher's message brought me hope and light. Darla's continued friendship and support brought stability and an assurance that as I had been through other problems, I would get through this one as well. Darla taught me to focus on things of light, even when dark clouds of destruction threatened to take over my every thought. I love Darla's poem because it explains the power of a friend in this process. It is as follows. One tiny candle. Determined to defeat daunting darkness, I feverishly tried to load it into buckets, carried, dumped, loaded again, until I collapsed exhausted. Darkness stood undiminished. I wept in frustration. Proven powerless, my task hopeless. A friend appeared, holding one tiny candle, one flickering flame. I gasped as one minuscule speck of light dispelled darkness. I threw my bucket far away and ran for candles. My friend's candle lost no light by lighting mine. We two passed our flames from candle to candle. Each tiny flame ate hungrily, ferociously, big gulps of darkness, replacing it with shimmering light. This effort not exhausting, but joyful. And I, a child of light, recognized at last my one true task. Where art thou? About 6 weeks into my depression, when the leader in our neighborhood church called me into his office to tell me that he had asked someone else to be in charge of the children's classes, I nearly collapsed. The badge I wore at church because I was over the children was the one thing lately that proved to me that God loved me and that I was spiritual. Without that, I felt stripped, vulnerable, naked, and alone, without any defense against the constant barrage of negative barbs Satan was throwing my way. His barbs put words into my mind, such as, "You're no good. You just think you're hearing the Spirit, but you're really not. You're crazy." Although I understood why I had to be relieved of the position, it was still extremely difficult to accept. It had been more than 2 months since I had actually functioned in the organization. Lori and Tammy had taken over for me and were running things without me. And my head knew that they really needed a functioning leader, but I desperately needed some kind of personal confirmation that I still had some thread of spirituality left. I had imagined this day of rejection for weeks now. Oh, I had seen the handwriting on the wall and already felt the coldness that accompanies spiritual aloneness. I felt my prayers falling flat on the floor, like ill-flipped hotcakes. I experienced the emptiness of pleading for spiritual warmth, only to feel that coldness once again. Once, when I shared my loneliness with my pre-teenage daughter, Cindy, she responded with wisdom far beyond her years. She gently reminded me that even Christ had to endure moments of eternity where he could not feel God's presence. In religion classes, she learned that if we want to be like him, we too must taste of pain and despair so that we can come to understand, appreciate, and love him more. My own spiritual lamp was feeling empty. I was comparing myself with Lori, Tammy, and others, and I was sure their lamps were fuller than mine. They seemed to be receiving inspiration and guidance with the children just fine without me. Instead of feeling grateful, I felt jealous because I wanted to feel the Lord's influence for myself. I felt a little bit like doubting Thomas that had to wait 8 days before seeing Christ, while all around him fellow disciples were filled with light and love because they had been at the right place in the right time to see the Lord. When I was originally asked to lead the children's organization, I felt the rightness of my position so strongly. I just knew I was meant to serve with the children. I had moved forward with many new ideas and great enthusiasm when depression began its chant of, "You're no good." I had not succumbed easily. There was so much to do, and my family needed me too. I fought valiantly for balance and sanity the first few weeks, but the day that I got so mad at Darren, I had collapsed into a heap of, "You're a terrible person." Now, as I sat facing this kind leader, fresh tears came to wash my heart anew with regret. I asked him one last question. "I shared with you an experience I had in my study a few months before you asked me to be the children's leader. While I was praying one morning in my study, I heard a voice in my heart that said, 'Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Do you think that really happened? Did it come from God?" The Spirit warmed my soul as he confirmed, "Yes, Patricia, I'm sure it was real, and yes, I do believe it came from God." As I left his office that night, the air was still. The moon was full. All was right with the world for a moment. And I knew that only the Spirit can create the kind of calmness I was feeling. As I drove back home, I remembered other cherished spiritual experiences and thought about how many scriptures mention the word remember. I remembered back to a day in Magna when I felt surrounded by the love of the Lord. I could now add to my special spiritual memories this interview with my inspired, loving friend and leader in the gospel helped me have. Often now, when I question my own spirituality and find myself asking, "Where art thou, Lord?" I reflect back on those moments when he sent pure love notes my way by manifesting himself to me through the sweetness of a spiritual experience, or through the love of a friend, a family member, or even a stranger. I have even created a small notebook with reminders of spiritual experiences to read when I want the assurance of God's love. Just long enough to learn. The peace that enveloped me at the church that night kept me warm for the night, but by the next morning the loss of my position assaulted me again. It hung over me like a small cloud, threatening to burst forth into torrents of tears at the slightest provocation. That morning I needed to get groceries. As I approached the produce area, I took in the sights and smells of the beige, rough-skinned, round cantaloupes, and I scratched where the stem had broken off to check for the ripe smell. Colors were all around me, but they seemed dull that morning. Soon I saw an acquaintance pass nearby who said, "Hi, Patricia, how are you doing?" Little did she know that her simple question would cause a cloud burst and send cascades of fresh tears. I told her my story and concluded by saying, I just feel so bad. I thought I'd serve for a few years and not flunk out after just 3 months. She smiled with understanding and declared, Patricia, one thing I've learned about serving in the church over the years is that I stay in a position just long enough to learn what I need to learn. Then, just about the time I get it, I am asked to serve somewhere else. You must be a fast learner. That familiar spirit of love and truth returned. The sun chased away my clouds for the morning, allowing gratitude to replace my fear with understanding and faith. Love notes from heaven. I have 3 special shoe boxes full of what I call love notes from heaven. 2 are full of letters and cards written by family and friends that express their love. The 3rd contains a small spiral-bound notebook I keep that has written memory joggers of miracles God has given me. The notes contain the times He has changed my heart or intervened in my life through whisperings of the Spirit, protected me from heaven, or has administered to my needs or the needs of others. When I feel lonely, I want to remember His love. I turn to these boxes and bask in the glow of their messages. It's amazing how soon the Spirit slips back into the room, making its way back into my senses and even lightly enveloping my heart until the coldness is replaced with a warmth, and that welcomes, heals, and reassures me once again. Words of wisdom that often aren't. Family members and friends mean well, but sometimes say things that just don't help. Such was the case with me. You shouldn't have added those extra daycare. You shouldn't have been involved in a magazine when you have young children. It's your fault. You invited this breakdown. You couldn't be a good mother and be involved in speaking and coping network. I told you so. You were too busy. When you were asked to serve as the leader of the children's organization, you should have quit all of your other activities. Well, some of these messages that came from family and friends were spoken out loud and based on reality and truth. Others were subtle, unspoken messages. Every one of them were followed up with my own accusing voices. It's all my fault. If I hadn't, I should be ashamed of myself. Who do I think I am? These gouges were generally started with, you should have, or you shouldn't have. Instead of moving me closer to recovery, they set me back. I needed love, acceptance, and active listening so that I could discover God's messages in His own way and time. I found that the best way I could tell helpful advice from well-meaning, hurtful advice was the feeling it created. If it was a good seed, it grew and brought good feelings. If the advice was not good or given at the wrong time, it generated guilt, fear, and negative feelings. I found that one of the best ways to handle that kind of advice was to say, thank you so much. I'm going to ponder and pray about that. I found that an index card, a small notebook, or page in my planner labeled My Ponder Page helped me stay focused and feel honest about my promise to ponder and pray. Looking backward to move forward. I knew instinctively that I needed to use cognitive therapy even more. See Chapter 6 and the index, or patriciapotts.com. So I got a spiral notebook, dated it, and began to list everything that was bugging me. One morning, my bugging column went on and on for 5 pages before I started writing my thought distortions. That is, mind reading, fortune telling, magnifying, labeling myself and others, etc. My talkbacks on the right side usually started with maybe ... but ... or true, but that's not true all of the time. Talkback example. Maybe others do wonder why I'm being released, but my friend gave me the gift of understanding. That helped me. Or, true, I did become too involved, but I had good intentions of trying to help others. Another one is not true. I am not lazy or stupid. I am imperfect and sometimes prideful, but I'm not stupid. As I continued analyzing what led me to the place where I now find myself, I delved deeper into my thinking errors and began to find answers. Somebody with skin on him. As I waded through my emotional stuff each day, I recalled the story of a 4-year-old little girl who had trouble sleeping. She kept calling out for her daddy at bedtime. He patiently went to her side to reassure her that she was all right and that she could go to sleep, and if she needed any help, she could always pray. The third time she cried out to him, he came to her with less patience and said, "Honey, I've already told you that there's nothing to be afraid of. Heavenly Father and his angels are here to help you." Her lower lip began to tremble, and she answered with a falling tear, "But Daddy, sometimes I need somebody with skin on them." There were times when I just needed somebody with skin on them. Even when I read my scriptures, prayed, and did cognitive therapy, sometimes it just wasn't enough. I needed someone to listen to me, someone to pray with me, someone to help me think through a situation, or just put their arms around me in a hug and say, "It'll be okay." In time, I created a friend therapy list, including friends and family members who were willing to be sounding boards for me. These were people with whom I could feel comfortable and real. When I needed to talk, I usually called the person at the top of the list and worked my way on down until I could find someone who had time to talk. Although almost always the person who was home and available was the one who said the very thing I needed to hear. They were my angels with skin on them. Eventually, I put in my cell phone, under T, therapy friends. Will you pray for me at 10 a.m.? It seemed as though life was on hold during the month or so we waited for my appointment with the psychiatrist. I did cognitive therapy and tried to apply principles that I had learned from my last depressions. All the while, my family, friends, and church members supported me. As my appointment drew near, so did my fears. What if this wasn't the answer? What if I didn't get better? I had heard of many people who had been put on medication for depression and not found relief. I did not want to be one of them. So, a few days before my appointment, I began calling family and friends and asking them to pray for me. "Please," I said, "would you pray for me around 10 o'clock on Tuesday the 12th? I'll be at the psychiatrist and I need all the prayers I can get so that he can find the right diagnosis and medication that might help me. I feel as though my prayers aren't going anywhere, and I sure would appreciate yours." In every case, they were willing to join in humble pleas heavenward, and I felt their love as I entered the doors of the place where mental illness was given a name, address, and label. From one step to the next, the dark clouds lifted. After waiting over half an hour on a brown vinyl-covered chair in the waiting room, I was ushered into the office of the psychiatrist. It was minus the couch portrayed in some television movies. The doctor's desk, cluttered with beige folders and handwritten notes, was huge, dark varnished creature, separating the expert, he, from the mentally ill, me. "So," the doctor invited after I sat down, "what brought you to my office?" I opened my notebook and began pouring forth words from my broken heart. I knew I had only a short time to portray the events that had brought these deep shadows and crevices into my life, and my sentences came out choppy, disjointed, and hurried. When our 1 hour was nearly up, the doctor interrupted me. "Patricia, from what you've told me, I would agree that it would be reasonable to assume that you are dealing with manic depression, commonly known as bipolar illness." He explained that this was an illness that caused a person to go from elevated moods and productivity to depressed moods and inactivity, and was generally treatable with a drug called lithium. "I think it would be wise to start you on lithium immediately and see how you respond to it," he concluded. The puzzle pieces started falling into place as I recognized highs, like the night I was typing for a coping network, and lows, like when I felt totally worthless because I became angry with Darren. My lows felt desperately low, like the time we lived in Magna and I left home, then later wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. I left the psychiatrist's office that day with a prescription for lithium and a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was more than one reason I had met Cher, who also had a bipolar illness. The prayers of others opened the heavens, and the right diagnosis was given that day. I started taking lithium as soon as I arrived home, and I thought I would go crazy with the shakes. I called the pharmacist and learned that time-released lithium was perhaps a better form of medication for me. So my doctor switched me to time-released that very day. During the next 10 days, I was either hyper, like the day I was obsessed about swatting flies in my living room, or I was limp as a rag, or crying. I checked out books from the library about manic depression, and I tried to learn all I could. 10 days after beginning the medicine, I was out taking my daily walk when suddenly my dark emotional clouds lifted. I recall the exact part of the block and the house where I stood. For me, the change was like night and day, and I could think clearly again. The medicine had begun to work.